Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you, wherever you are joining us from for today's discussion, exploring decolonial feminist praxis for transformative and equitable futures. Hi, I'm Dr. Emma Rule, and I'll be your moderator over what will be a whistle stop 50 minutes as we dive into what it means when we talk about decolonial feminism, why we think its integration with futures and strategic foresight is a vital one, and in line with this week's theme of impact for change, hear from our fabulous panel about how it has contributed to the change in the world that each of them and their organisations and partners are working towards. After the initial reflections from our panelists, we'll be opening up for Q&A. So please do use the chat box over the next 50 minutes to introduce yourself and drop any questions that you have using the Q&A function. And now to get us started, I'd like to very quickly pass over to my colleague, Tiffany Nasiri Ansari. Tiffany, over to you.
Thank you, Emma. And while we wait for the slides to go live, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the session. And we really look forward to the next 50 minutes of learning with and from each other. So waiting for slides, but in the meantime, UNU IIGH is the United Nations University's designated think tank for global health. We are the International Institute for Global Health based in Kuala Lumpur, with a mandate to serve global south perspectives and needs. About 5 years ago, we were tasked with understanding how futures and foresight might be able to serve to advance our mandate and to be integrated into our goals of health equity and gender equality. And so from our initial explorations, that was really a period of reading and learning. And Caslin, if we could get to the next slide, thank you, and lovely. So we undertook this period of reading and learning, and in the chat, you'll find a working paper documenting some of our initial findings. But really quite quickly, what we learned was that if we were to go on this journey, there were 3 guiding principles we wanted to keep in mind. And the first was really about cultivating academics. Futures and foresight is a rich literature. It's a rich academic practice, but it is very much for us about the impact and the change that it can make. And so it wasn't so much about absorbing all the theoretical knowledge as it was understanding how we might be able to implement practically. And so that brings us to our second, sorry, if we could go back, Caslin. That brings us to our second principle about implementing equity. It wasn't enough just to bring futures and foresight to our, if we could go one more slide back, please. It wasn't enough just to bring futures and foresight to our work, but to think about it critically and to question where the tools have come from, whose agendas we were serving, and how we might be able to adapt and align with some of our other principles. If we could go back to the original slide, please. And third of all, it was really for us about adopting a jigsaw puzzle approach, understanding that futures and foresight is not a silver bullet, but never is a silver bullet for very complex and intersecting problems that we face and would like to address. And so how would we be able to integrate that with a whole host of other tools in our toolkit? And so very quickly, what we realized, and if we could go back to the slide, please. Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Constance. Very quickly, what we realized will not be new to anyone who has even a passing familiarity with future thinking and strategic foresight. It comes as no surprise that this field is very much grounded in Western military and corporate needs and has historically been used by power holders to further exploit and oppress communities the world over. With this knowledge weighing heavily on our minds, at the same time, we were exploring what it would mean to bring a decolonial feminist lens to our work. So working on these 2 threads in parallel, it became very obvious to us that if we wanted to truly interrogate power asymmetries in global health and work toward long-term action to shift power, we needed to weave the 2 threads together into a decolonial feminist futures process. There are many ways to understand and approach decolonial thinking, feminist thinking, and decolonial feminism. And our approach is one way, the way, emphasizing that pluralism is a core tenet to these concepts, and our work as collectives who advocate for these values is greatly enriched by the many understandings and interpretations that each of us brings to the table. So I want to start by acknowledging that our praxis is very much building on decades of work and literature on coloniality, post-coloniality, and feminism by those who have walked this path before us, such as Annabel Chiano, Maria Lugones, François Vigues, and many more. I hope my audio is picking out. Many of you might have heard of post-colonial theory, which focuses on envisaging what countries and societies could and did look like after the ejection of colonial powers. Post-colonial theory presents this very linear chain of events in the order of colonization, decolonization, post-colonization. But reality is never that neat, and decolonial theory is perhaps a better reflection of the persistence and pervasiveness of coloniality. So while colonization refers to the physical act of invasion, appropriation, and exploitation, coloniality refers to more intangible dominance over various systems of power. And using coloniality as an entry point allows us to identify how and why systems, structures, and societies remain exploited, oppressed, and subjugated even long after physical occupation has ended, such as in my home country here in Malaysia, become normalized, as is tragically the case in settler colonies like the United States, Canada, and Australia, or perhaps never even occurred in the first place, such as in Thailand. Decoloniality then allows us to interrogate, challenge, and disrupt these systems of power which perpetuate coloniality, be they remnants of physical occupation, such as legal and political structures, or imports and impositions, such as structural adjustment programs. These manifest across the three spheres of coloniality: power, knowledge, and being, and through four levers of coloniality. And to Keanu, coloniality is based on the imposition of a racial ethnic classification on the world's population as a cornerstone of the pattern of power. Decoloniality then shapes how we work as individuals and institutions, locate ourselves within systems of power and knowledge, and become part of the change we want to see. If we could move on, please. But crucially, the colonial project has always been racialized and gendered at its very core from its very beginning. And many believe that Keanu's three spheres do not sufficiently capture this. Maria Lugones, for instance, conceptualized the coloniality of gender as a missing sphere in Keanu's framework. And Latin American feminist movements have been known to insist that decolonization cannot succeed without depatriarchalization. Lugones writes, I call the analysis of racialized, capitalized gender oppression the coloniality of gender. I call the possibility of overcoming the coloniality of gender decolonial feminism. François Vigues, meanwhile, urges the use of a decolonial feminist lens to hold together the past, present, and future, but without foreclosing the possibility of better futures. She understands decolonial feminism as a bridge that brings together many threats through a kaleidoscopic narrative that sees our futures as malleable, nonlinear, and most importantly, agentic, allowing us to make possible kaleidoscopic visions of our own and imagine rich, pluralistic decolonial feminist futures that are not just post-patriarchy, not just post-coloniality, but post all intersecting forms of oppression and injustice. So decolonial feminism to us is a tool for analysis and a tool for action, provides a practical approach to interrogating facets of power, and emphasizes the need to adopt an intersectional and multidimensional approach. It helps us to understand what happened to shape current realities, what continues to drive inequalities, and what needs challenging and dismantling to advance gender equality and health equity. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, through our futures journey, and as we started integrating our decolonial feminist understanding and our futures praxis, we have been privileged to work with many people to iterate and refine this praxis, some of whom are on this panel, and you'll be privileged to hear from shortly. In 2023, we started with a 3-day in-person meeting focused at the systems level to interrogate what enabling environments to advance gender equality and health might look like. And from there, we've taken deep dives into different pockets of the ecosystem that have been identified as strategic sites for change to collectively envision the transformations we need and the actions we can take. Working with small but diverse groups of experts, we've interrogated funding and philanthropy, collective action, community engagement, and health systems and health workforces, amongst other topics. Throughout, we've been able to adopt a reflexive approach to continuously iterate our praxis and have developed these three guiding questions. Futures by and for whom? Whose voices and needs shape our visions of the future? Who is considered an expert in locating where we are and identifying where we might go? And how has this been shaped by colonial hierarchies of race and gender? Futures based on what and why? What knowledges and methods inform our visions of the future? And why do colonial notions and epistemologies continue to limit our evidence bases? And finally, futures to what end and how? How is power being wielded or challenged? By whom and to what end? Who benefits from the ability to shape and realize potential futures? And to what extent do colonial systems and structures of power continue to dictate authority and influence? Over the past 5 years, we've been privileged to have many opportunities and many fellow colleagues go with us on this journey. And you'll have seen quite a few links in the chat now where you can read about some of the tools that we have adapted or adopted and some of the approaches and guides that we have put into place to help us continue to iterate what it means to be a decolonial feminist futurist. But crucially, we are here to learn about the people who have been able to implement these values and these approaches for change and for meaningful impact. And so perhaps looking at the time, Caslin, if we could skip ahead. You'll have some of these links in the chat as well, where we've explored some of our futures work. And Emma is providing more information for the sake of time in the chat box. Thank you, Emma. So please do keep an eye on that. This is a broader series in which our futures work is embedded, but if you'd like to learn more about our decolonial feminist approach, it's embedded across these 12 papers as well. Now, moving very quickly, because I'm not the person you're here to listen to. Without further ado, I'm going to pass back to Emma so that we can bring our amazing panel on and start learning more about how they have achieved impact for change through transformative and equitable practices of strategic foresight. Back to you, Emma.
Thank you very much, Tiffany, for that introduction to decolonial feminism. I really want to focus the bulk of this conversation then on what it means to actually do this in practice and the impact that it's had on people's work. So, Katindi, I would love to come to you first. You have been integral to the development and iteration of our futures approach and have been working with us over the last few years now. And we've been really appreciative to learn about one that is centered in systemic or a use of strategic foresight that is around systemic and structural change for equitable futures. As a long-time futurist now, who has been working with Kenyan Senate Futures Caucus, with the Kenyan Senate Futures Caucus, what has the process of driving the uptake of strategic foresight at the national level been like? And what have been some of the changes that you've seen as a result?
So thank you, Emma. Thank you, Tiffany, and thank you to the group for putting this together. Just to answer the question quickly and briefly, I think it has been a long journey. I've been in this work for 20 years, and I started off by trying to influence policy from outside. And what then I quickly realized is that when you're not in the system, there's a lot of mistrust, and perhaps you're an outsider, so you're not very welcome to those conversations because people are very suspicious. So the first thing I think I learned quickly is that even if you're doing very strategic work that in a sense could help policy to be very proactive, it becomes very useful for you to be an insider. And so one of the things then I started doing is really wondering how we can build capacity of people within government to understand foresight. And just to cut the long story short, we had a young lady who got it. Her name was Brenda, Dr. Brenda Ogembo. And she's a political scientist. She's working within government. And because she's a technocrat supporting parliament, she was able to begin proposing these ideas to Senate. The other thing that was very interesting was as long as she was considerably a junior officer in the sense, I mean, not as high up as the senators themselves, she wasn't also making traction, but at least it was coming from inside. The second thing was that she needed a champion that then could, had the power and the leverage to mobilize. And so we got one of the senators called Honorable Olekina, who then got it, started questioning the issues around, debt and what could have been done earlier rather than after. And because of his championship, it was much easier then to mobilize his fellow senators to begin to see the idea. Obviously, what happens is that in political cycles, people come and go. And of course, it's politics, so people have tunnel visions. So the other thing is to really build the capacity of people who are going to transcend those 5 years to be able to stay with the work. So training officials from different departments, of course, thinking about institutionalizing, but also asking where are the intersections of this work. So obviously working with research officers in different departments so that it's not just Senate that is carrying it out, but different advisors from different points of view, so that then you can get a lot of traction. lastly, I will say that you have to continue being very strategic because obviously, I will not always be there. Brenda will not always be there. So if you anchor this work in individuals, then you're obviously setting yourself up to fail. And obviously, foresight is about structures and systems. So the question becomes, how do you institutionalize this work across board? I started then working with the Kenya School of Government to train their officers to actually see the point of foresight, get their buy-in so that they can get programs, training programs. And because all public officers pass through their hands, then it is much easier to have a system, a conveyor belt that keeps building people that can have this different way of thinking and hopefully then transform the kind of policies they put in place. So then the transition from being the consultant to really embedding this skills in different people was a trick, the tool in the bag. Thank you. And back to you, Emma.
And Katindi, while I have you here, that mindset shift being embedded across the workforce, what impact have you seen that have over the time that you've been working with the caucus?
So our story has been very long. I mean, I'm talking 24 years. So it has been moving from that place. So I'm talking about we have to give time because political processes are very slow. But the second thing is that it took failure for us to begin to see the power of foresight. Failure in the sense that we had foresight that could have given us intel 7-10 years before, but people didn't take it up. So it is in the second and the third iteration that people began then to buy into this process. And therefore, that mind shift didn't come automatically because remember, foresight is working counterculture. The predominant way of working is linear. It is about, conventional data rather than qualitative data. And therefore, you're really working against the grain through and through. And so sometimes people need proof of concept and therefore case studies and things like that that have worked before in other places, but also failure actually is one of the ways in which we began to see a mind shift. But also, I mean, when you get into so much trouble and you have no way out, then people become more open to actually exploring new ideas. So it took a post-election violence, it took a youth protest, it took COVID for people to finally get it and to begin saying, you know what, it doesn't have to have one more tool in the bag. And so perhaps we need to let people fail. If at all, it will help people change their minds on using foresight. So that has been our journey. Hard lessons which we didn't need to go through, but it was necessary for us then to pick it up and be a bit more purposeful about using foresight for policy.
Thank you so much for that extra reflection. There's so much in there to pick up on, but I'm going to save it for the questions and quickly move over to Jessica. So Jessica, over the years, we have had the privilege of drawing on your expertise and leadership at the intersection of decoloniality and feminism to enrich our own decolonial feminist practice. So thank you. And during your time with the African Women's Development Fund, you led the process to integrate a futures lens into the organisation strategy development. So I wondered if you could speak to us a bit about why you felt it was so important to integrate that lens and what the impact of embracing this approach organisation-wide was.
Going to share some quick slides along with it, just so you can see some of the images from the futures work as well. So pleased to be here with everybody. So Jessica, I come out of African feminist, and I say African in the sense of transnational African feminist work around the body, actually, around gender and health and women's rights. And I came into AWDF having done quite a bit of work with organizations around strategy development. I joined as director of programs, so in a senior leadership position, tasked when I joined in 2015, at the end of 2015, with the process of revising the organization's strategy and looking at a new 5-year strategy. Now, it was interesting to me that as much as the work, of course, and all of the mission and vision statements, much with most organizations in the social justice sector speak about, we look to create a world where, so that assumes that basically the work of the organization is about shaping the future, right? And building different futures because you're trying to build a different world. Actually, the whole strategic process is focused on looking at the past. And it also felt a little bit like the strategy and approaches also needed to be a bit more contemporary. So by temperament, I'm a maverick. I'm a questioner. I'm interested in loosening up and thinking about things differently. And I felt that this would be a good process. I had worked before on some other strategy processes that had incorporated futures, but not in a sort of rigorous, not as rigorous a way. And so I thought, okay, we have to find an African woman futurist to help us with this, because the mandate of this organization as the first regional women's fund, first African women's fund, was really a bias for us. And I asked and I asked and I asked and I asked. There were very few, and we lucked upon Dr. Katindi, who supported a brilliant process that really, I think, almost shook the soul of the organization, really trying to move people into thinking about the future, but also getting their heads around some of the empirical analysis and the trends, which again, in a way, begin to question some of your assumptions around who Africans are, who African women are, what Africa looks like, and where Africa is headed, even if we look at, again, presuming the trends of now will continue into the future. So out of that, we created a number of things. So the first was actually we looked into that data in more rigor and produced what is the first futures trends analysis, looking at the future of Africa from the vantage point of women. We had to rely on mainstream data because that's what's available. But we did add in like qualitative analysis from a feminist lens. In the process of developing this, we also then we wanted to do a 2030 future. So we also went into the process of developing scenario stories, which is a creative process of looking at the trends, looking at the different axes of drivers, and then coming up with 4 different scenarios. One of them is pictured here at the bottom. Now, we wanted to embrace the fact that Africa is urbanizing. And that also it was really critical that if we were going to have a protagonist in the stories that we created, that it needed to be representative of what the future might look like. And so we chose this young woman, Mariam, who is urban, she's educated, and she's in a wheelchair, because that was our way of forcing even ourselves to think about multiple axes of complexity, potential inequality, but also potential innovation and freedoms, right? And we worked with an animator and actually animated these 4 stories, and they're available on YouTube. And then out of all of this, we actually developed a new strategic direction. So both from the empirical and the imaginative, we then said, okay, and so if these are the potential futures that AWDF is going to be stepping into with this mandate of shaping a future that is actually a future where African women and girls can thrive, what would that look like in terms of what we do? So what did it produce? I mean, obviously it produced a strategic plan and this set of documents, but I think it actually really pushed this issue of new knowledge. I mean, even amongst ourselves, we began to realize that there was a lot we didn't know. And we genuinely produced new knowledge in the sense of an analysis that hasn't existed before, these imaginations of the future. And this again this is a process in 2016, and we've now seen a blossoming of that kind of work in the sector in general. It began the seeds of a shift in mindset. I'm not going to claim that the whole organization shifted in its mindset. There was a lot of old thinking and also a lot of assumptions, like I said, based a little bit in stereotype that, for example, all African women are poorer, agricultural, right? When we're looking at data that says that actually by 2030, 91% of Africans are going to have access to a mobile phone, half of Africa is going to be urban, and the number of people in urban slums is going to be doubling. Again, it begins to shift the question of everything from access to food, right, to mobility, to questions of safety and what that looks like in cramped conditions. It also forced us to really engage new substantive issues. And I think from a health perspective, one of the key things was actually the question of non-communicable diseases and the sharp rise in NCDs, and the way that our work, if it focuses at all on health, tends to focus on on communicable disease, right? And a need to really shift, in particular, to engage mental health, but also to engage other diseases that are in part the result of food inequalities, like the diabetes and hypertension, etc., and also cancer, which is a question also of the control of carcinogens. So to just quickly conclude, what needs to shift? I mean, I think from this process, it was very clear that the data was insufficient. And again, that it was not at all developed from an African feminist frame. A quick example, data on reproductive health implies that there's an interest in reducing family size and a general interest in some sense of access to contraceptives. From a feminist perspective, we're interested in how much control do women have and how much knowledge do women have about their own bodies and the choices that they can make about their reproductive health, right? That's and sexual health. That's a question that African feminists would ask, and the data is very thin. We need to change who is in the room. It's very obvious that the ways that futures have been imagined are not, if African women are even there, they're potentially objects. We need to, stop them cutting down trees for firewood. We need to stop them having babies. It's not necessarily thinking about what does it look like if African women are actually agents of the future, right? They're subjects, not objects. And lastly, we really need to rethink our assumptions, which is a point made at the very beginning, about who and what is relevant and who, as I said, are the actors of the future. By 2050, Africans are going to be 1/4 of humanity, which means that African women are going to be about 1 in 8 people in this world. So again, at what point do we begin to say that we need to actually pay attention to the vast diversity, right, of that reality and to fully integrate it in the question of what the future is, and again, how we lean into making sure that it is the most ample, the most beneficial, the most rights-based, the most equal that it can be. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for sharing those reflections. As somebody who grew up in a background where very often I was the only brown person in a room, the opportunity to think about the heterogeneity of the Black experience, of the African woman experience, of the Caribbean woman experience is so important, and for it to be less reductionist. So thank you very much for sharing that component with us. Sam, coming over to you, we have had the opportunity recently to co-author a paper calling for a shift towards decolonial feminist trust-based philanthropy, kind of recognizing how important, how much money confers power in the system that we have. And the paper draws on insights from a set of 3 Horizons workshops that we co-convened with others working in and across the funding sector, hoping to lead to systemic change. Do you mind sharing with us some of the actions that we felt needed to be brought to life and how we might do that?
Great. Thank you, Emma, and as well, Tiffany, for the opportunity to be part of this panel. Now, except people have been living under a rock, I think it is clear to everyone that international development is at a crossroad that some of us saw coming, that others hoped will come sooner than later, and that others completely ignored or dreaded, I would say. But I see this as an opportunity that challenges us to rethink international development and specifically global health, how we fund global health, as well as why and for whom we fund it. And in our paper that is part of this series, we argue that conventional philanthropy is no longer fit for purpose. It is riddled with top-down structures, paternalistic practices, harmful assumptions that are rooted in colonialism, racism, patriarchy, and other isms. And we observe that many funders set priorities that are often far removed from the lived experiences of the communities and the people they purport to serve. We observe that funders reward proximity to power and not proximity to need. And worst of all, funders escape accountability because there is no mechanism for mutual accountability. For example, funders can walk away from a program or initiative or even an entire thematic area whenever they feel like. And local communities, grassroots organizations, women organizations are left holding the bag, so to say. So we need a radical transformation in global health philanthropy. And through our paper, we attempt to sort of rethink and reimagine the future of global health philanthropy using a futures methodology. And what we see in that long-term future is a future in which, by adopting trust-based decolonial feminist principles, global health stands out as an exemplar of how to achieve gender equality in international development. And that future begins, that we envision, begins with five clear calls to action. That first, funders must embrace trust-based practices. And what this means is it means unrestricted multi-year funding to grassroots organizations, to women's organizations, to feminist movements. It means simplifying application and reporting processes. It means listening, and I mean truly listening to local communities and centering their priorities over bureaucratic procedures. Because trust is not a luxury, it is the foundation for effective and equitable development. Second, we must embed feminist and decolonial values in philanthropy. These values demand that we shift power, not just symbolically, but materially into the hands of those who are most affected by inequality. And this requires changing not just who gets funded, but how decisions are made, who sits at the table, whose knowledge or expertise is valued and deemed legitimate. Third, we must institutionalize mutual accountability. Grantees in the global south are often subjected to extreme levels of scrutiny, all in the name of due diligence. But how about the funders? Why should accountability only be unidirectional? So in the future that we visualized, through the action of decolonial and feminist activists, funders adopt a code of ethics and a mutual accountability framework to ensure that they themselves espouse the values, uphold the values that they espouse. Fourth, we must move beyond projects and start investing in strengthening organizations and funding movements. Funders must do their homework and find ways of working with decolonial and feminist organizations, particularly those at the grassroots. They must provide core support and invest in movement resilience, especially as the civic space continues to shrink worldwide. And finally, we need to act now. We must say no to what Sheye Abimbola called during one of the Three Horizons workshops, diabolical farsightedness, which I interpret as setting lofty goals for the future while doing the wrong things now in the present. So we need to start doing the right things today and now, while keeping our eyes on the future, the future that we want. We need to think in decades, but act on a daily basis to uproot the structures and systems that have failed us and continue to perpetuate inequalities and power imbalances in global health philanthropy. And I think that we can do this by committing to embrace the principles of trust-based decolonial feminist philanthropy that we mentioned in the paper. So back to you, Emma.
Thanks very much, Sam, for taking us through those really important features of what needs to change. So I'm going to continue our journey across the world from Asia, where Tiffany and I are, through Africa and Europe, over to the Caribbean to invite Kobe to turn your microphone on. Kobe, we have had the pleasure of co-convening Futures conversations with you and fellow activists across the Caribbean. As the executive director of the Guyana Responsible Parenthood Association, how has the adoption of a decolonial feminist futures mindset impacted the way you strategize and work as an advocate for significant, systemic, and sustained change?
Thank you, Emma, and good morning, everyone. Well, good evening, depending on which part of the world you are. I greet you in peace. Peace is part of the noble purpose of the United Nations, but also it's part of the essence of the wish of the women and girls and other vulnerable groups that we all serve. I am pleased that Emma and her team, Tiffany, really saw it necessary to have someone from the Caribbean to be part of this particular space, because oftentimes our contributions are lost in LAC, Latin America, and the Caribbean. I disagree with that. The Latin America and the Caribbean region, though we're lumped together, we're totally different. And so I'm really happy that there was this strong intentionality to really have a Caribbean voice today on the panel. And so I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be part of these conversations about how we see the future as we move forward. And so, as executive director of the Guyana Responsible Parenthood Association, GRPA, adopting this decolonial feminist futures mindset has really been fundamental as I try to reshape how we lead, how we coordinate, how we advocate, how we collaborate, but also how we reimagine impact at both the community and systems level. For us, it's not just about shifting policies or delivering services, it's also about transferring and transforming power. Decolonial feminist thinking really invites us to center the lived experiences, the agency, the ancestral knowledge, considering our history, and really the communities that we serve, especially Indigenous peoples, Afro descendants, LGBTQ plus persons, young people, women, girls, migrants. Considering the migrant crisis in the Caribbean region, which is really occasioned by the political crisis, not just in Haiti, but also in Venezuela. And so these groups, their voices have often been excluded or tokenized in development spaces. And so it's really a time for us to push the envelope to ask critical questions. Who is being left behind? Who is being left out of the conversation and why? Whose knowledge is being dismissed as non-expert? I know that Emma spoke about that, but really and truly, how do we see expert and expertise, and where exactly are we getting that kind of narrative from? Are experts only from the global north? We completely reject that, because depending on what your experiences are, you could in fact be an expert. And also crucially, what do accountability and justice look like when we really start from the margins? And so this shift has really shown up in a lot of our work. Most of our work now has really been shifted in the hinterland communities, considering that Indigenous people represent some of the most impoverished communities and persons in our country. And so most recently, we wrapped up a climate smart agricultural and entrepreneurship skills training in Indigenous communities. And there are a lot of people that were asking, okay, you lead, the National Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights Organization. Why are you engaging in climate smart agriculture? But the reality is that in order for us to address the unmet needs of sexual and reproductive health, we have to ensure that those vulnerable communities that we're trying to uplift and lift up, that they're economically empowered, and that we give them the tools to be able to address those particular barriers, whether they be financial, economic, and others. And so that would not have been possible without unlearning this kind of top-down approach and embracing the model of shared power, because those communities would have said to us, we just don't want contraceptives. We just don't want cancer screening. We also want opportunities to be able to afford those particular services by ourselves. And so that's part and parcel of our strategy to really move the needle for those particular persons and communities. And so strategically, it's made me more intentional about who's in the room at every level. It's not enough to just send an invite for participation. We need to redistribute leadership. At GRPA, this means and continue to mean elevating young people, elevating Indigenous voices into decision making, co-designing programs with them, and also being accountable to them. At a more personal level, as a young Black Caribbean person, I carry this work in my bones. I lost my mother 9 years ago to ovarian cancer because she didn't have access to quality health services and information. And that injustice really shapes who I am and everything that I do. But now I don't just fight for services, I fight for systems, equitable systems that honor dignity, that centers women, that honor autonomy, and that really seeks to challenge and overcome injustice at every level for every person, especially those that the system would have failed. And so, yes, decolonial feminist futures mindset has made me more brave, has made me braver, and it's reminded me that advocacy isn't just about evidence or funding. It's about imagination and reimagination. It's about solidarity. It's about love. It's also about community. And if we're really serious about this work, if we're serious about the United Nations, if we're serious about the development spaces, we will embrace this shift, not just as a trend, but as a transformation. I thank you so much.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Kobe. And I hope what everybody on the call or joining us today has had a chance to see is that as we embarked on this work at UNU IIGH to think about enabling environments towards gender equality and health equity and what that would look like at the systems level, this real recognition that we were going to need to traverse what is happening at the local, global, and regional levels and across all these different stakeholders and parts of the global health ecosystem and beyond, because health is not confined to the systems or structures of health. So, over the last kind of 40 minutes, we've had an opportunity to learn a bit about the theory and also to visit government and funding and NGOs and CSOs. And so now what I would like to do is to share some of the questions that we've received from people on the call today and for people who registered in advance as we come into the final few moments. And so the first question that I'd like to place to the panel came from Anna Tyrion as part of the registration. And she had asked, how do we communicate these ideas diplomatically with global stakeholders, particularly when we're thinking about a decolonial feminist lens to the work that we're doing, without seeming to be imposing Western values? So I guess just a new form of neo-colonial thought. Would anybody in the panel like to pick up the mantle of that rather meaty question? Jessica, please.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting turn, only because I don't know if we're able to be neo-colonial as a marginalized majority. But if it's about how do we contest in a polite way and explain to people that some of their premises are incorrect or incomplete, we're talking about shifting power, and shifting power is never easy. But like I said, we are the majority. It's a demographic reality, and actually it's going to become more and more the case. And so I actually think it's smart policy to recognize that. If you are building global work that is missing, right? It's underestimating, and it's in a way misjudging or misprojecting what the world might be, it's going to be bad policy. So I actually think that this vantage point is important and shouldn't just be taken as critique, or it shouldn't just be taken as theory. I think the point is just that people are saying, look, we are as invested in transforming the world. And again, we actually constitute a numeric majority. And that actually it might be wise to incorporate, our vantage point, because like I said, whatever solutions exist are also going to be solutions for us, and you could make a massive investment and fail, right, and waste your money and waste your energies because it's failed to actually integrate the vantage point of the people that it's actually engaging. So I feel like it's strategic to do so. And exciting. I think people are bringing all manner of new information, new approaches, and that should be exciting actually for anybody interested, like I said, genuinely interested in the process of making change and thinking about how we actually make durable impact.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and I agree wholeheartedly that it is good policy for all of us. Katindi, I see that you've got your hand up. I'm going to ask if you want to respond. That'd be great.
Yes, very brief. It's just also to say that I think there isn't any other way of communicating the truth except overtly and loudly and intentionally, because that's what the truth is. And I think part of the problem is the fact that we're in this problem because we don't communicate our truth, and therefore I don't think there's any point of hiding that truth. I think there's an issue about how we frame issues. I think there is need to reframe a lot of issues, because that then brings out that truth that we want to communicate. The other thing is that using data, especially what we mentioned earlier about lived experiences, is important. Being upfront about who wins and who loses is important, because all these things are embedded within systems, and because of not talking about them, they continue hiding and continue then disenfranchising us. Thank you.
Katindi, while you've got your mic on, I'm going to put the next question from Lucy to you. And Lucy asks, what makes a foresight approach different from the gender analysis and planning processes that organisations already employ, given that planning is by virtue a future-based activity?
Yeah, so one of the things is that a lot of the analysis that is done literally looks at the surface level, so events and ideas and patterns that are going on. But underneath that, I don't know whether the person is familiar with the iceberg analogy, is that there's a lot more going on underneath the worldviews, the systems and structures that support the things that we see at the surface level. And therefore, if we don't seek to have that systemic understanding of issues, that usually doesn't come out when it comes to perhaps gender analysis or all those linear synthesis. What then begins to happen is that then we really don't understand how things are working, how things are interconnecting. Sometimes what are the unintended consequences of these things? And therefore we prescribe a bandage where we need a cast. Just to speak very briefly. And so it's important to do a much deeper analysis, look at different intersections, just to be able to come up with the real truth. But also a lot of times when we do the analysis and not involve people, what then again tends to happen is the experts that are having the voice. It's not people with lived experiences. So the thing about foresight is that you have an opportunity to do all these things together and then figure out what is coming up. Again, a lot of analysis is very historical and present. Foresight tries to say, how do we look at all that, but also then look at the future so that we are intentional about creating something totally different.
Thank you for answering that. I'm going to take the last question that came to us in the box, which was asking, how can we reshape futures thinking to dismantle intersecting systems of oppression and coloniality? And from the work that we've been doing, this is something that we've thought about a lot, kind of the epistemic origins of futures and foresight practice. And it has been a combination of kind of understanding which domains particular methods have come from and what they were intended to be used for. And some of those we found are not fit for purpose. We found those for our purposes, there are particular flavors of foresight that have really resonated with us. Jessica talked about participatory approaches, approaches that are really anchored in narrative, that give people a diverse range of ways to engage with futures. And so sometimes that means taking existing methodologies, but really thinking very intentionally either about the topics they're applied to or the methods of facilitation. There are also some really fantastic futurists out there who are imagining and creating whole new models. So Pratishka Singh is one that always comes to mind for her fantastic Lotus model that looks at decolonial futures. Katindi referred to Sahal and Ayatollah's iceberg earlier and causal layered analysis that really helps us dive into the myths and metaphors, the stories we tell ourselves that underlie our present and what that might mean for our futures. And so I think as much as we have to be very intentional in the way that we adopt these tools and these processes to ensure that we don't inadvertently reinforce asymmetry and inequity. So as we come to the final couple of minutes, I would like to invite each of our panelists to give a final kind of thought and to share with us what you think is lost in the work that we do if we fail to integrate a decolonial feminist approach to our work for equality and justice. And Sam, I'm going to start with you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Emma. I think, like I alluded to, we are at a time in history that calls not just for reform, but for reimagination. Particularly for those of us in development, I think it's time to reimagine philanthropy, not as a tool of control, but as an act of solidarity, not as charity, but as justice. And to us as funders, and speaking to myself as someone who works for a funding agency, to reimagine our roles not as gatekeepers of resources, but as stewards of trust and partners in transformation. And when we fail to integrate decolonial feminist futures approaches, we are really failing to reimagine things in a systemic, structured, and inclusive way. And I think we'll make the same mistakes of the past. Come 2030, when the SDGs are about to expire, we'll come up with a new set of development goals that push marginalized groups even further into the margins, while at the same time the anti-gender, anti-rights, anti-aid movements remain focused on doing all the gains that we have made. I hope no one wants that. Back to you, Emma.
Thanks, Sam. Toby, if I can come to you next to ask the same question.
I think if we fail to incorporate the colonial feminist mindset, it means that we're failing change and we're failing people. I'm 27 years old, even though I look like 37. I apologize. But I think I always say to my colleagues, I've been seeing and hearing these issues for decades. I mean, I was just a child a couple of years ago. And it seems like we're doing one set of things over and over, and we're not seeing the changes that we would like to. And so it means that we have to do things better and different and reimagine, and we're not doing that. When it comes to funding, when it comes to funders as well, I say to my colleagues locally, there's some funders that we're just not going to engage with because they're unsustainable, they don't support our rights, and every potentially a couple of years the pendulum shifts. And so even that kind of mindset about who do we look for, not just funding but support from and partnerships, even that kind of mindset we have to change. The ways in which we channel resources, the way in which we co-design programs, the ways in which we see research. Like in our region, there are only certain people that we look for citations from and research from. As only until those persons come into our countries, then we're like, oh my God, like they're from the global north, so it has to be true. That is a bit problematic. We have expertise where we are, indigenous expertise, expertise that are localized, and we're not looking and supporting it and giving them the credibility. And so Bob Marley years ago said that we need to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery. I don't think that we've reached that particular point as yet, because we're still doing the same things that we've done. Well, not me, because I haven't been here for 30 years, but collectively, we're still doing the same things that we had. And we need to shift that, because women and girls will die. Women and girls are dying. And that's just the reality. When we look at the climate, when we look at the environment, when we look at development, we're not where we're supposed to be, and we can and must do better.
Thank you, Toby, for those powerful words. Katindi, to you.
I think the tragedy of not thinking this way is that we keep perpetuating the very injustices we claim and the inequalities we claim that we are transforming, because we are not paying attention. We have all these unintended consequences. And unfortunately, we don't have that luxury, because now we are moving from not just a poly crisis but to a perma crisis and to a meta crisis, because all those things are intertwined and they're growing. And so we have to shape up, really. We have no choice. Thank you.
Thank you, Katindi. And Jessica.
I mean, I think in this historical moment, there's a lot of us who are sitting there saying to the world, we told you so. So I think one of the things that we lose is the fact that we're actually leaving most people behind in the ways that we're running affairs, the way that we're investing, the way that we're planning policy, because we're not paying attention to the vantage point of the majority. But as Kobe mentioned very powerfully, what's so interesting actually about the ways that we've always organized is we're inherently inclusive. We're always trying to get our heads around, we're like, okay, you're also part of our community and you have a disability. You're also part of our community. You're living with HIV. You're also a part of our community and you're gender diverse. You're also, we're constantly trying to ensure that actually everybody has a place, a voice, and to be. And so for me, I just think if we're genuine about this agenda of leave no one behind, we actually have to embrace this, because this is actually a vantage point that enables you to do that. I think just a quick answer to Gail's, or kind of echo what Gail was asking about, in the questions. I think one of the problems of not adopting a futures mindset is that we see literally only the year in front of us and we're in crisis. And all we see is a dystopia. What's beautiful about a futures approach, and again, what is different from a planning approach, is that the future opens up multiple possible futures. It does not presume that the way things are is how they're going to be. So that is one possible trajectory among many. And so what it does is it gives us back our agency, because we're able to imagine that there are other potential futures and to then invest in thinking about how we get to the alternatives. So I think if we don't adopt this approach, and again, from the vantage point of decolonial feminism, which basically is for everybody, right? It actually is a framework that enables everybody to be involved and to engage. I think we miss out on this potential of leaning into the idea that we can actually change this, right? That it doesn't have to be this way, and that we can actually build something different.
Thank you so much for that, Jessica, and to all of our panelists for the interventions this evening. Every time I have a conversation with the four of you, you have all heard me say it's never long enough. We only ever get to skate over many of the issues that I would love to delve into more. I'd like to say a big thank you to everybody who's joined us on the call today for coming and listening to us. Tiffany has been dropping links into the chat. We have really focused a lot on the impact of the work that we've done, not so much on some of the processes. If you want to know more about that, check out the links, follow our amazing panelists. They all post their thoughts very eloquently on LinkedIn. You will continue to learn more. And with that, I say thank you very much to everybody for joining us. I wish you a lovely end or beginning to a Thursday, and the weekend is nearly here. So thank you very much and goodbye.